Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, let's dive in.
It's strange how a holiday meant for joy and warmth can leave you scarred forever. For years I've dreaded Christmas Eve, not because of bad memories with family or lost traditions, but because of something that happened when I was just 16, something I've never spoken about. It's too bizarre, too terrifying to sound real. But every year, as the clock inches toward midnight on Christmas Eve, the memory comes back, clawing its way to the surface. It all started on a quiet, snow-dusted night, the kind of night you see in Christmas postcards. Fireplace crackling, soft carols playing, the scent of pine and cinnamon lingering in the air. My parents were upstairs getting ready for bed, and my little brother Timmy was fast asleep, probably dreaming about Santa's visit. I was sitting alone in the living room, lazily flipping through a magazine. The twinkling lights of the Christmas tree cast a warm, golden glow across the room. Everything felt peaceful, until it didn't. At first it was subtle, like the air had shifted, grown heavier somehow. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But then came the sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and dragging across the snow outside. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to dismiss it. Probably just the wind, I told myself. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable crunch of heavy boots, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. The sound stopped right outside the back door, and then a thud. I jolted upright, my heart racing. The door creaked open. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate groan of hinges that seemed to echo through the house. My parents were still upstairs, and there was no way Timmy could have come down without me hearing him. Panic set in, but I forced myself to move. Grabbing a fireplace poker, I crept toward the hallway. That's when I heard them. Voices, low and guttural, whispering from the living room. I stopped in my tracks, my grip tightening on the poker. The voices weren't coming from my parents, and they definitely weren't Timmy's. My stomach twisted as I heard the faint jingle of bells. Not the cheerful kind from Christmas songs, but something slower, more deliberate, like a warning. I peeked around the corner, and what I saw rooted me to the spot. There in front of the fireplace was a man dressed as Santa. But this wasn't the jolly red-suited figure you'd expect. His suit was old, tattered, and smeared with something dark. Something I prayed wasn't blood. His face was hidden behind a tangled white beard, and his sunken eyes stared into the fire with an unsettling intensity. But it wasn't just him. In the corner of the room, half hidden by shadows, stood a little girl. Her dress was torn, her face pale as a porcelain doll's, and her eyes, her empty, unblinking eyes, locked onto me. My breath hitched. The man muttered something under his breath, his voice low and gravelly, like it was coming from somewhere deep within. The language was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The girl didn't move, didn't even blink. She just stood there, staring. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My body refused to listen. Then the man stood. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. He turned toward the girl, leaning down to whisper something in her ear. She didn't react, but her gaze shifted, locking onto mine. And then I heard it. Behind me, the sound of a door creaking open. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing in the doorway was my mother. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, confusion. I opened my mouth to speak, but she didn't say a word. Before I could move, the jingling of bells filled the air again, sharp and piercing. I turned back to the living room, but the man in the Santa suit was gone. So was the girl. The room was empty, the fire crackling softly as if nothing had happened. My mother blinked, her expression softening. She looked at me like she hadn't seen a thing and told me to go to bed. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Timmy tore through his presents with the joy only a kid on Christmas morning could have. My parents acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake it. The sight of that man, the girl, the chilling look in their eyes. And every Christmas Eve since, as the clock strikes midnight, I can't help but wonder if he'll come back. If somewhere out there, behind the warm glow of holiday lights, that shadow of Santa is still waiting. If you've ever had an experience like this, or if you have any idea what it could have been, let me know. And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good horror tale, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Stay safe this Christmas Eve because you never know who or what might come down the chimney. It started with a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, a sound that seemed to drift through the icy air as if carried on the breath of winter itself. The kind of whisper that tickles the back of your neck and leaves you glancing over your shoulder, searching for something that shouldn't be there. I should have trusted my instincts that night. It was a quiet, snow-dusted evening, the type where the cold bites deep and the world feels unnaturally still. I'd been invited to a Christmas party by a co-worker named Dave. While I didn't know many people on the guest list, I figured it would be a decent way to embrace the holiday spirit. The house sat at the edge of a forgotten neighborhood, the kind of place where streetlights flickered and shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. It was charming in an old-fashioned way, with its steep roof and twinkling Christmas lights, but something about it felt wrong. Dave greeted me with an overly enthusiastic smile, his handshake firm but lingering. His energy was unsettling, not quite nervous, but something else I couldn't put my finger on. I chalked it up to holiday stress and stepped inside. The warmth of the house was immediate, the scent of pine mingling with cinnamon and something sour, barely noticeable but enough to make me wrinkle my nose. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, and the dim lighting cast long shadows that danced on the walls. As the party began, more guests trickled in. Laughter, clinking glasses, and festive music filled the air. But despite the cheerful noise, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. Something was off. My unease kept drawing my gaze to a door at the back of the house. It was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Nobody seemed to acknowledge it, not even Dave. If anything, he avoided looking in its direction altogether. I tried to brush it off, mingling with the crowd and sipping mulled wine, but the door's shadowed crack gnawed at my curiosity. Then it happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A voice. At first I thought it was part of the music, but the low murmur was coming from the direction of the door. I froze, straining to hear. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably wrong, like a growl wrapped in a whisper. My curiosity overpowered my fear. Quietly excusing myself from a conversation, I weaved through the crowd until I stood before the door. My hand hovered over the wood, hesitating. Then, as if it sensed my presence, the door creaked open on its own. Cold air spilled from the room, sharp and unnatural. I stepped inside. The room was dim, lit by a single flickering lamp in the corner. Its weak light barely reached the walls, which seemed to press inward, heavy with an oppressive stillness. At the center of the room sat a small table, and beside it, an ancient armchair. The chair was occupied. A man slumped in it, his back to me. He wore a faded Santa suit, its red dulled to rust, and its trim stained yellow with age. His skeletal hands gripped the armrests, pale and almost translucent. My breath caught in my throat as the air around me seemed to thicken, and then he moved. The man's head turned slowly, painfully, as though every vertebra creaked with resistance. When his face came into view, I stumbled back. His eyes were sunken, milky white and unblinking. His cheeks were hollow, his skin ashen and stretched taut over his skull. He opened his mouth, and the sound that emerged wasn't human. "You shouldn't be here." The words slithered through the air, low and guttural. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey my mind's desperate plea to flee. And then his hand twitched. That tiny movement broke the spell. I stumbled backward, tripping over the doorframe as I scrambled to escape. Slamming the door shut, I leaned against it, my chest heaving. The party buzzed on as if nothing had happened. No one seemed to notice my wide eyes or shaking hands. It was as if the house had swallowed my terror whole, keeping its secrets buried. But I couldn't stop looking back at the door. It remained closed, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. The rest of the evening was a blur. I didn't wait for the party to end. I mumbled an excuse to Dave and left, the cold night air biting my skin as I hurried to my car. Days later, I learned the house's history. A family had once lived there, a seemingly happy household that vanished one Christmas Eve without a trace. The land itself was rumored to be cursed. Whispers of unnatural deaths and vengeful spirits attached to it. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but sometimes late at night I hear a voice in my dreams, low and guttural, saying the same chilling words, "You shouldn't be here." If you've ever felt the sinister pull of a place that hides secrets better left undisturbed, Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy tales that linger in the shadows of your mind, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. The night was a chilling canvas of silence and snow. Christmas Eve 2017 had blanketed the city in a serene, almost deceptive stillness. The soft glow of streetlights illuminated the icy streets, but their warmth was nothing compared to the creeping cold that seemed to settle into every shadow. I had spent the day bustling through last-minute errands, brushing shoulders with strangers whose laughter and cheer reminded me just how alone I was this holiday season. By 11 p.m., I was back in my tiny apartment, the glow of my modest Christmas tree casting colorful reflections across the room. The TV hummed faintly in the background, its flickering images a weak attempt to break the oppressive quiet. Wrapped in a blanket, sipping lukewarm hot chocolate, I tried convincing myself that solitude was what I wanted. No family, no friends, just me. Peaceful, right? But peace has a way of twisting into unease when you least expect it. The sharp ring of the phone shattered the stillness. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping at the sight of an unfamiliar number. Not local. The area code wasn't even one I recognized. Normally I'd let it ring out, but something, curiosity, loneliness, or maybe something darker, made me press the green button. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed the faintest quiver. The reply came almost instantly, a voice so low and cold it seemed to seep through the receiver. "Are you alone?" The words froze me. They weren't asked with concern or curiosity. No, they were sharper, almost accusatory. My pulse quickened. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice faltering. A long pause followed. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Just as I was about to hang up, the voice returned, darker and more insistent. "Why are you alone?" My stomach twisted. I couldn't explain it, but I felt trapped. Like the voice had reached through the line and wrapped icy fingers around me. "What do you want?" I snapped, trying to mask my fear with anger. The reply came not as words, but as a chilling chuckle. It was distant, hollow, and utterly devoid of warmth, the kind of laugh that doesn't belong to anything human. "Look outside," the voice commanded. The air seemed to drain from the room. My breath hitched as I hesitated. "No," I muttered, my voice barely audible. "Look outside," it repeated, softer now, but somehow more menacing. Against every instinct, screaming at me to hang up, to run, I moved toward the window. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, each step amplifying my dread. Slowly I pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peer out into the darkness. At first there was nothing, just the snow-covered street, empty and silent under the pale light of the lamps. Then I saw it. A figure stood across the street, just beyond the reach of the light, tall, cloaked in a long dark coat, with their face obscured by the shadow of a hood. They didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. They just stood there, facing my window, watching. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The phone was still pressed to my ear, but I couldn't speak. The voice came again, now unbearably close. "Do you see him?" I turned my head toward the phone, as if doing so could somehow pull me away from the scene outside. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer, just a faint chuckle, followed by words that sent ice through my veins. "He's watching you." The line went dead. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing in the oppressive quiet. My chest heaved with shallow breaths as I forced myself to glance back at the window. The figure was still there, unmoving. And then came the first thud. It echoed through the apartment, a heavy, deliberate sound against the front door. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a knock. It was something heavier. A fist, a shoulder. Another thud followed, louder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. I backed away, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Run? Hide? I grabbed the nearest chair, wedging it beneath the doorknob with trembling hands. Thud. The sound was deafening now, each impact reverberating through the tiny apartment. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just the dim, flickering light of the old bulb overhead. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowly unlocked the door and cracked it open. The hallway was as empty as it had been when I first moved in. No footprints in the snow outside my door, no signs that anyone had been there. I slammed the door shut, bolting every lock and checking every window. I unplugged the landline, powered down my phone, and sat in the center of the room, every nerve in my body on high alert. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched lingered long after the phone call, long after the figure outside vanished. Even now, every Christmas Eve, I'm haunted by the memory of that night. And whenever the phone rings after dark, I can't help but wonder if I'll hear that voice again. The cold December night wrapped around me like an icy shroud, the wind whispering secrets that I wished I couldn't hear. Snow crunched underfoot as I approached the Christmas tree farm, the kind of place that should radiate warmth and joy. But tonight the air carried an unnatural stillness, a weight that pressed against my chest and made every breath feel labored. I had been looking forward to this Christmas, my first attempt at embracing the holiday after a grueling year of personal loss and relentless work. The thought of picking out the perfect tree and decorating it in my little cabin felt like a small step toward reclaiming a sense of peace. That's what brought me here to the Hansons' Christmas tree farm, a place that had always been a beacon of holiday cheer in our small town. But as I stepped out of my car, something felt wrong. The farm was deathly quiet. No families laughing, no carolers singing, not even the flicker of hot chocolate stands that used to dot the lot. Only the dim glow of string lights cast eerie shadows across the snow, their flickering almost deliberate, like a warning. "Hello, Mr. Hanson? Mrs. Hanson," I called out, my voice swallowed by the stillness. The barn door stood slightly ajar, creaking faintly as if inviting me in. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The barn was just as I remembered it, the cozy crackle of a fireplace, baskets of candy canes, and ornaments displayed on wooden counters. But tonight the air was thick with a sour, decaying smell that turned my stomach. It clung to the walls, to the rafters, to my skin. I called out again, louder this time. "Mr. Hanson? Mrs. Hanson?" Still no answer, only silence, broken by the faintest rustle from somewhere deep in the shadows. My eyes scanned the barn, and then I saw it. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, taller and fuller than any I'd ever seen. But it wasn't adorned with the usual festive ornaments. Instead, its branches held crude carvings, twisted, grotesque faces etched into what looked like human bone. Their hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, their expressions frozen in silent agony. Shivers crawled down my spine as I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't just shadows, they were shapes. Tall, dark figures stood just beyond the reach of the flickering light, their outlines shifting as if they were alive. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling, but before I could unlock it, the barn door slammed shut with a thunderous crash. The sound echoed through the space, followed by the metallic clink of the latch locking from the outside. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, my breath quickening. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. A whisper came from the shadows, faint but unmistakable. "Leave, now." The words sent ice through my veins. They came again, louder, more insistent. "Leave, now." I bolted for the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at me as I turned back toward the room. The grotesque carvings on the tree seemed to shift, their faces contorting into expressions of rage. And then I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Mrs. Hanson, or what was left of her. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes bulging unnaturally wide. She wore her signature red scarf, but it was tattered, stained with something dark. Her mouth twisted into a grimace as she rasped, "You shouldn't be here." I backed away only to hear another set of footsteps behind me. Spinning around, I came face to face with Mr. Hanson. His expression was just as warped, his eyes sunken and lifeless. In his hand, he held a long, rusted knife. "Leave," he said, his voice a low growl that made my knees weak. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. The shadows seemed to close in, the air thickening until it felt like I was drowning. Somehow I forced myself to move. I turned toward the nearest window, hurling myself through the glass and into the snow outside. I hit the ground hard, shards of glass biting into my skin, but I didn't stop. I ran, the cold biting at my face, my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, I'd see those twisted faces staring after me. When I finally reached the road, a passing driver stopped to help. I mumbled something about the Hansons, about the farm, but my words didn't make sense even to me. The next day I went back with the police, desperate for answers. But the farm was gone. The barn was still there, but it was empty. No trees, no decorations, no sign of the Hansons. It was as if the place had never been touched by Christmas at all. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. The authorities chalked it up to stress, maybe even hallucinations. But I know the truth. Something dark lingers on that land, something that wears the face of holiday cheer to lure people in. Every Christmas, as the wind howls through the trees, I hear whispers in the night, and I wonder, who will be next?